Hi, everyone. The province has just introduced the excess soil regulations, and it's causing a lot of questions to come in. I've been receiving lots of calls from members, and many are wondering how it will affect them. Others have reported that it has affected them already because their traditional dump sites will no longer accept soil. And today we are pleased to welcome Rima Qureshi, who's a policy analyst with the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. Rima has offered to give us an overview of the legislation and answer any questions you may have. So Rima, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Johnny, and thank you again for inviting me to speak today. I hope I clear some of the questions people have been having. And I think right now you can see my presentation screen only, hopefully.
Yes.
Thumbs up, yes, okay, great. Okay. So for this presentation, I'll provide an overview of the excess soil regulation and some of the key concepts that it introduces. I'll go over the key requirements, some of the best practices as well. And I'll also discuss some frequently asked questions and answers that we get at the ministry. And after the presentation, I'm also happy to answer questions from the audience. And I'll also be sharing a few resources that we've been working on, along with resources that are some industry partners I've worked on as well, which might be useful to the people on the call today. So just a quick note that the presentation that I am going over today only provides an overview of the excess soil regulation with plain language summaries of the regulation. It shouldn't be substituted for legal advice, and I'll encourage you to refer to the most recent version of the regulation if you have any questions. So the excess soil regulation, OREG 4619, formerly called On-Site and Excess Soil Management, is a regulation that was finalized in December 2019 under the Environmental Protection Act, or the EPA. And it's supported by a few other documents. So one of them is the Rules for Soil Management and Excess Soil Quality Standards document, or the rules document, which is adopted by reference in the regulation, and it should be read alongside it. There's also something that's called the Beneficial Reuse Assessment Tool, or the BRAT, which is a tool that's used to develop site-specific quality standards for a site, which I'll get into a little bit later. And there's a few other changes that have been made to our existing regulations around waste management and brownfield regulations to align better with this regulation that just came into effect last year. So the regulation has been rolled out through a phased approach. The first key requirements came into effect January 1st of last year. They introduced some of the key reuse rules around excess soil and the new excess soil quality standards. The next set of requirements came into effect this year, Jan 1st, 2022. And finally, a requirement also comes into effect in January of 2025, which I'll speak to in a bit more detail later on. So what is excess soil? Under the regulation, excess soil is defined as soil, crushed rock, or soil mixed with rock or crushed rock, which has been excavated as part of a project and removed from that project area. So that's the key definition that we have to look for if you're trying to understand whether this regulation applies to you or not. Now, there are a few situations that I've highlighted in this green box here where the regulation would not apply. Including hazardous waste, asbestos waste, removal of debris or sewage from a catch basin, hauled sewage, material that is all or largely rock, greater than 2 millimeters in size, aggregate from a pit or quarry that's operated under the Aggregate Resources Act, or excavation of topsoil with a permit under the ARA as well. Production of peat from peat extraction operation, and final placement of any soil on a surface water body. So all those situations are where this regulation that I'll go into a lot of detail about won't apply. And the key thing you have to look at is the first bulleted definition that I've provided. So why is excess soil regulated? Before this regulation came into effect, there were a lot of unclear rules around the management of soil. There was a lack of specific quality standards. The costs of trucking and relocation of soil were pretty high, and there were issues around illegal dumping of contaminated soil that would occur as well. So this regulation now provides clear rules for excess soil so that it isn't illegally dumped and it can be beneficially reused. It provides new soil quality standards that can be used for determining the appropriate quality of excess soil when it is being reused. And it also ensures that excess soil that's moving in large volumes or that may be contaminated is being appropriately tracked. So who does this regulation apply to? It applies to essentially anyone who is involved in the management of excess soil. This could include project leaders of source sites, referred to as project areas under our regulation, which are basically the areas where the excess soil is excavated from. And project leaders are the ones who are responsible for often determining the soil quality or locating appropriate sites for where the soil should go. It also applies to soil transporters or haulers. It applies to various types of interim storage or processing sites where soil might be temporarily kept, as well as sites like soil depots, reuse sites, landfills, or dumps. And it also applies to qualified persons who are professionals who are often required to carry out certain requirements in the regulation. I did want to quickly highlight the role of the project leader here. Project leader is the person or persons who are ultimately responsible for making decisions about the project, including how the excess soil from the project should be managed. So I'll now go over some of the key concepts that this regulation introduces. First, is the excess soil reuse concept. So the regulation designates excess soil as a waste. So if it is illegally dumped or improperly managed, appropriate actions can be taken to handle that. And the regulation outlines criteria that allow soil to be beneficially reused and not be considered a waste. And this criteria, I've listed it here, but it essentially requires that there is a direct transport of excess soil to the reuse site, that the reuse site owner or operator provides explicit written consent to take the soil, and that the quantity and the quality of the soil is appropriate for whatever the beneficial use is. The soil should also be dry unless there's an instrument at the site that explicitly allows for liquid soil management at the site. The next major component of the excess soil regulation is the exemption of certain low-risk activities from needing a waste approval from the Ministry of Environment. So if certain regulatory requirements are met. This includes the hauling of excess soil, certain low-risk on-site processing methods that are allowed, and some establishing of some temporary soil storage sites that, again, are exempt from needing a waste ECA with certain requirements in place. The next thing I want to go over is the excess soil quality standards. So the regulation provides clear risk-based standards for what quality of excess soil can be safely reused based on the property use at the reuse site. So for example, if it's an agricultural site, residential site, commercial site, etc. Another option that the regulation provides is the option for reuse sites to develop site-specific quality standards, which can account for factors at a site that are different from the factors provided under the generic quality standards. And these can be developed through that tool that I mentioned before, the BRAT, or a risk assessment, or an RA. There's also specific rules for different types of reuse sites under the regulation to, again, guide the appropriate reuse of soil at those sites. So this could include sites that are used for growing crops or sites that are in environmentally sensitive areas. And there's also rules for specific types of soil. So for example, salt impacted soil or soil mixed with compost. To find out more about these rules and the excess soil quality standards, you can refer to that document I'd mentioned earlier, the Rules for Soil Management and Excess Soil Quality Standards, which lays out all of this information in a lot more detail. So the next thing that I'll quickly go over now, but I'll get into this a bit more detail later, since I think a lot of people might be interested in this particular topic. But this regulation introduces something called planning requirements. And what that means is that project leaders of some sites, particularly those with larger or riskier soil movement, might be subject to additional planning requirements that they have to carry out, often involving a qualified person's oversight. So these requirements include things like filing a notice on an online registry before the soil gets moved off-site, completing certain reports like assessment of past uses, to determine if the site may have had any potentially contaminating activities needed. And also, if needed, a sampling and analysis plan may have to be completed. And project leaders may also have to develop and implement a tracking system as well as part of these requirements. Another key concept the regulation introduces is responsibilities for larger reuse sites. So the rules that I just talked about with the planning requirements were for project leaders or the source sites. There are some requirements if sites are accepting greater than 10,000 cubic meters of excess soil. These sites also need to do a bit more a few additional requirements to register a notice on the registry if they're accepting this much soil, and to have procedures in place to track and inspect the soil that's coming to their site for reuse. Next, for transportation requirements, all excess soil movement is required to have a hauling record, and I'll speak about this more later as well. But this record essentially should outline information where the soil is coming from, how pieces of information. And the last thing I want to mention that this regulation also introduces is a landfilling restriction. So in 2025, there is going to be a new restriction in place that prohibits soil that can be reused, so if it's of certain quality, from being disposed of at a landfill. Soil can still be sent to a landfill for beneficial uses like daily cover or berms. So now we'll move on to some of the requirements for the source site or the project area. So soil is excavated and it stays on the same site and it's reused within it. It's not considered excess soil. So as you'll remember, the definition of excess soil that I provided was that it's excavated material that is then moved off-site. So if it's not moved off-site, it's not excess soil. And therefore, most of the rules in the regulation would not apply to it. And this includes things like meeting applicable excess soil quality standards, sampling, filing a notice on the registry, etc. Some rules that would apply in that situation are rules around on-site storage to ensure that there's no adverse effect from the storage of soil at the site to the environment. And I've outlined these in an appendix, which just go over the different types of rules that would apply for storage at the site. Some types of low-risk processing can also take place at the source site. Without needing an approval from types of processing, so they can include things like passive aeration, passive dewatering, etc. And some methods may require a qualified person to ensure that the procedures are carried out properly. That you can find these rules and then both the regulation guidance document that we have available, which is a fact sheet on project area requirements that is available on the ministry's website that you can also access to find more plain language information around this topic. So next I'll discuss the planning requirements. These are essentially additional requirements that apply to larger projects. And by larger, I mean projects that are excavating greater than 2,000 cubic meters of soil, which roughly is around 200 trucks of excess soil. And they also apply to riskier projects. So these are projects that have potential contamination. They could include things like gas stations or dry cleaners, or where the soil is being excavated for the purpose of remediating. Previously include filing a notice on the online excess soil registry, which is a publicly available registry, completing reports like an assessment of past uses, if required, doing a sampling and analysis plan, soil characterization, completing a destination assessment report for the excess soil, and developing and implementing a tracking system. So again, before I move on from this, I just want to emphasize again that these requirements typically do not apply to smaller or low-risk projects. And I'll go over some scenarios later that may help show how these requirements do or don't apply. So next, even if you are triggered into planning requirements under the regulation, there are several exemptions. Certain include scenarios that maybe lower management isn't changing. For example, you may excavate less than 100 cubic meters of excess soil, which might be heavily contaminated, but it's being sent to a landfill, in which case the planning requirements wouldn't apply. Other situations would include partial exemptions, from, especially the requirements where a qualified person is required to complete reports. Like the assessment of past use and sampling analysis. For example, if you're moving soil from a sensitive property use like residential, and the project is going to do those reports that require in Schedule 2 and Section 14 of the regulation, which you can look at to get a better understanding of all the different scenarios that could apply to your project. So I'll go over two scenarios myself here, just to put this a bit into context. So the first scenario is a landscaping company is digging up.
Hey, Rima, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let you know that you're cutting out a little bit. Not sure if there's anything you can do about that.
Hi, Rima. I was going to say maybe turn off of your camera, and that might help a little bit, and we can see where that goes from there.
Okay, great. Thanks for letting me know, and let me know if this helps. If not, I'll try something else. Okay. Sorry about that. So I'll continue on with the scenario. So the scenario is a landscaping company is digging up 100 cubic meters of soil from a project in a residential area with no known or suspected site where it's taken out from isn't considered excess soil. So other than on-site storage or processing requirements, if the wouldn't apply for the soil that's being reused at the same site. For soil that's being moved off-site, a written agreement soil, which I mentioned earlier, were one of the criteria for beneficially reusing soil. As well, the hauler that's transporting the excess soil will need to carry some information on them about where the soil is coming from and where it's going. The scenario will be exempt from planning requirements, including the need to do a sampling and analysis plan that's required by the regulation, because less than 2,000 cubic meters of excess soil that's being excavated, and there's no known or suspected contamination. Just checking in. I hope it's I'm still clear right now and it's not cutting off.
It's still quite a bit choppy, Rima. I'm not sure if you're able to do a hotspot or something else.
I can see if I can log on through my phone. I'm really sorry about this. Hi, Julissa. I've just tried to join the meeting through my phone. It says I'm in the waiting room.
Okay.
Wondering if you can just let me in, then we can try to see if that works better.
Should be good to go. And if you don't mind, could you go back to the first scenario? We had one of the attendees request that, as that probably seems where it was cutting out the most.
Hi, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah, I think you should be good to continue, but if you can go, back to the first scenario. Perfect.
Okay, that was good. Great, thank you so much. Apologies again for the issues. Okay, so scenario one, I'll just quickly go over this again. If you're digging up about up to 100 cubic meters of soil from a project that's in a residential area with no known or suspected contamination, where some of the soil is being reused on the site and some of it is being taken to a separate reuse site. The requirements that will apply in this situation is for the soil that's being reused within the project area, that isn't considered excess soil. So other than the on-site storage and processing methods that may apply, and those requirements around that, those would be the only applicable requirements in that situation because it's not considered excess soil. But for the soil that's moving off-site, which is considered excess soil, a few other requirements would come into play. So getting a written agreement from the reuse site that's accepting the excess soil, as well as the requirement for the transporters or the haulers of excess soil to carry a hauling record that includes information about the soil, including where it's coming from, how much of it is in the truck that's taking it, and where it's going. And where the exemptions would come in effect from this regulation would be that this scenario would likely be exempt from the planning requirements, including the need to do things like registering on the registry and developing a sampling and analysis plan, because less than 2,000 cubic meters is being excavated from an area that's not known or suspected to be contaminated. Right? So move on to the next scenario. So in the scenario, there is about 2,500 cubic meters of excess soil being excavated from a project. The project is in a greenfield residential area without any known or suspected contamination, and it's being brought to a reuse site that's also a residential use site. So in this situation, the requirements that would apply would again include that written confirmation with the reuse site. That is a requirement that's always in place for reuse sites. Haulers, again, will need to be carrying a hauling record that includes information about the soil and where it's going. That again applies to all movement of excess soil. And because there's greater than 2,000 cubic meters being excavated, in this situation, there may be a need to file a notice on the registry and to establish a tracking system. Now, where the exemption comes in is because the excess soil is moving from a residential site and going to a residential site without any known contamination, there could be partial exemptions that apply with needing to do those reports where a QP is required, an assessment of past uses, sampling analysis plan, etc. So that's where there might be an exemption in this scenario. So what if you discover unexpected contamination in your project? So if you discover through smell or visual cue that the soil that you're excavating is affected by contamination, the excavation work should stop immediately, and procedures should be applied at the site, such as segregating the potentially contaminated soil that is already excavated, identifying the areas of the planned excavation that may still have some contamination and be modified accordingly, and disposing of any of the excavated contaminated soil at an appropriate facility. Now let's discuss some of the requirements around transportation of excess soil, which I briefly mentioned earlier. But all transportation of excess soil requires something called a hauling record. which is a physical or electronic record that includes information such as where the excess soil is coming from, when it was loaded, how much soil is being transported, and where it's going, among other pieces of information. The destination site that receives the excess soil should confirm receipt of the soil, and it's generally a good practice to provide a copy of that confirmed record to be provided back to the project leader of the source site. Other than that, the regulation also exempts the transport of excess soil from needing an approval from the ministry. This could be through an ECA or what we call the Environmental Activity and Sector Registry, provided that they follow the rules in the regulation. These rules include ensuring that the vehicle can safely transport the soil, that it's leak-proof and covered, and that it doesn't emit any dust or odors. Transport of liquid soil is also included in this exemption, but it also has additional rules that need to be followed to ensure the safe transportation, such as having locked valves on the truck. We've developed a fact sheet on the transportation of excess soil as well. That's available on our excess soil website. The link of that will be provided to this deck, which can be a good plain language resource, again, to understand the full requirements related to this topic. Next, I want to spend a little bit of time on the different types of storage and processing sites or interim sites that can be utilized for excess soil management. In most cases, if the rules under the excess soil regulation are followed, certain sites won't require a waste approval from the ministry to operate, while others would based on the kind of operation that's taking place there. And the chart below summarizes the types of different sites as they're outlined within the regulation and whether or not an ECA is required. So I'll go through each of them quickly to give you a bit of context for what these are. So residential development soil depot is a type of soil bank or storage site that is used to manage excess soil from various residential sites on a temporary basis, which will then be taken for final reuse. Retail landscaping soil depots are sites like gardening depots that accept excess soil for the purpose of packaging and selling it as gardening products. And I'll go into a bit more detail about the rules for this type of site later. Next, we have local waste transfer facilities, which are defined in a separate regulation, Regulation 347, which is our waste management regulation. And they're essentially sites where the primary purpose of the site isn't waste management. So it could be things like equipment storage, for example, where waste is temporarily bulked, stored, and transferred. And these types of sites only receive waste from what we call field operations, which has a lengthy definition under Regulation 347, but includes things like construction. Next, I'll talk about Class 1 and Class 2 soil management sites. So Class 1 soil management sites are soil banks or processing sites. And basically, these sites do require a waste ECA to be in place, which allows them to store excess soil from various projects, for example, of varying qualities, and to conduct processing as needed to manage the excess soil. Class 2 soil management sites are a different type of site that the regulation outlines. These are sites where dry excess soil can be managed on a temporary basis. They don't require a waste ECA if the regulatory rules are followed. And one key thing for these types of sites is that the owner and the operator, these sites need to be owned by a public body or by the project leader from where the excess soil is coming from. And they also need to be operated by the project leader as well, so that the responsibility of managing the soil stays with the project leader. That's a key thing to remember about a Class 2 site. I just wanted to spend a bit more time highlighting this site, since it might be applicable to some of the Landscape Ontario members. The regulation exempts retail landscaping soil depots, which include things like garden centers, from needing a waste ECA to operate if regulatory rules are followed. And some of the key rules are that these sites can only manage dry soil. Some low-risk processing activities are allowed at these sites, such as passive aeration or size-based sorting of the soil. A written notice needs to be provided to the local ministry district office before any soil is accepted at the site. They can only have 10,000 cubic meters of excess soil at one time, and they're only allowed to accept a certain standard of excess soil. And I'm just pointing out that it's table 2.1 residential use, but you can look at that in a bit more detail within the rules document to find out more information about this particular rule and the other rules that are around these types of sites. So I'll quickly cover some of the best management practices next for excess soil management. Early planning and on-site or local reuse. So maximizing the on-site reuse of excavated soil or crushed rock is encouraged, as this both reduces the regulatory rules, since the soil won't be considered excess soil to the site. And there may be other benefits such as reduced hauling or disposal costs. If on-site reuse is limited, there may be opportunities through the local community and through the excess soil registry that's publicly available as well to find reuse sites that may need soil in your area. Another best practice is to review any municipal bylaws, for example, that may have additional rules around excess soil storage, just so that you're aware of what those rules might be. And these rules could include things like restrictions on noise or operational hours for the facility that you may want to set up for the storage of soil, and prevention of any other negative impacts to human health or the environment. A notification to the ministry for interim sites. So there is a requirement to provide notice to the ministry for certain sites, like landscaping depots, before any soil is deposited there. But earlier notification and engagement is always recommended so that the owner or operator of these sites can discuss any questions or issues with the ministry's local district office if needed. And consultation with others such as the municipal or regional governments and conservation authorities is also a good practice for setting up any interim sites. The qualified person oversight. QPs are required in some situations under the regulation, but they aren't always required for excess soil management. But retaining one to oversee the management of excess soil for larger projects particularly might be useful to make sure that soil is managed appropriately and without any negative impacts. Okay, so next I'll just go over a few questions that we often get at the ministry that may be helpful in answering some of your questions as well. The first question is, does the regulation apply to small residential projects? Just want to emphasize again, if a project is excavating soil or crushed rock, even in small volumes from residential sites, the regulation will apply to them, but they will likely be exempt from the more extensive planning requirements that I had gone over previously. So as I went over in my scenarios, the things that apply to all soil movements will also apply here. And these are things like getting written consent from a reuse site, having hauling records for the transport of soil, and some record-keeping requirements, which I'll quickly mention in a minute as well. And what you will be exempt from are things like those planning requirements, including mandatory sampling and analysis that are outlined in the regulation, which includes things like minimum parameters or sampling frequencies. So those are, as I'd mentioned, generally required for larger projects or projects that have contamination issues. And smaller residential projects will likely be exempt from having to do those requirements. And even if they are triggered for some reason, there are still exemptions built in that could exempt you from those planning requirements. So for example, if you excavate some contaminated soil and there's less than 100 cubic meters of it, which is a smaller amount, and all of that goes to a landfill, you would be exempt from the extensive planning requirements. Does the regulation apply to topsoil? So topsoil is defined in our regulation in the same way that it is in the Municipal Act. The regulation doesn't apply as a whole, If topsoil is being excavated under an Aggregate Resources Act permit, but otherwise the regulation would apply to it as to any other excavation of soil. So things like hauling records, written consent from reuse sites, etc. Regarding planning requirements, there is a specific exemption that I just wanted to highlight that applies to topsoil. So if you are excavating a large amount of topsoil, greater than 2,000 cubic meters, for example, but it's being reused elsewhere as topsoil and it's not contaminated, it'll generally, again, be exempt from the planning requirements in the regulation. Next, can a contractor bring soil from multiple projects back to their own property for storage or processing? Generally, if that's the main purpose, the contractor is bringing back soil from several different sites for storage and processing at the site, they would require a waste ECA from the ministry to manage it. There could be other situations, for example, if a municipality or other public body is leading some projects and they can identify a local waste transfer facility like a public works yard to which contractors could temporarily manage the soil at, that could be allowed without needing a waste ECA. Or contractors that are not primarily in the waste management business can make use of their own local waste transfer facilities and that field operations exemption I mentioned previously to temporarily manage excess soil. Question, what is considered beneficial purpose? So beneficial purpose is essentially the use at a project or at an undertaking of soil that's required for completing that project. And it includes examples like backfilling, site rehabilitation, grading, or berms. So simply stockpiling or disposing of excess soil or dumping is not considered a beneficial purpose. And aside from the things that I mentioned, which, that's not an exhaustive list of what a beneficial purpose could be, if a site-specific instrument is in place, like a municipal bylaw, for example, that could also outline a specific beneficial purpose for a reuse site. What are my record-keeping requirements? The regulation requires all parties that are involved in the management of excess soil to keep records and documents created under this regulation for at least 7 years. Hauling records are required to be kept for at least 2 years. So are all the hauling requirements applicable to smaller soil movements? Yes, in short, hauling records are required for all movement of soil, regardless of the amount of material being carried. Another common question we get is, does the issuance of a bill of lading satisfy the hauling requirements? So as long as the key information required for a hauling record that the regulation outlines is included in the document, the ministry doesn't really prohibit what form it can be found in. And that provides a bit more flexibility for businesses to use systems they have in place or other formats that they use for hauling to just include the information that's required within what they've already been using for transportation of product. The Ontario Environmental Industry Association, or ONIA, has developed a hauling template that may be used if organizations are looking for a tool like that. The link again is provided in the deck as well. I'll just quickly go over a few additional resources that I'd like to point your attention to that might be useful. So one is our excess soil Ontario government page, which includes links to the most recent regulation, the rules document, and they also include links to our excess soil fact sheets, which are some plain language documents that we have to provide a bit more explanation and interpretation of the regulatory rules that apply to project sites, to reuse sites, and to the transportation of excess soil. The Ministry of Transportation also is working on their Ontario Provincial Standard Specification, or OPSS 180 form, which provide the general specification for the management of excess materials, including excess soil, which may be useful for some people on the call. Next up, there's the Resource Productivity and Recovery Authority, or RIPRA, which is the organization that has developed and is maintaining the excess soil registry. So their website has some resources for people who are trying to understand how to set up an account, how to file a notice, etc. We also have some industry organizations that have developed some best practices and templates, one of which I mentioned was ONEA, which has some best practices for hauling, temporary sites, and qualified persons that you can access. And there's also a Qualified Persons Community of Ontario, or QPCO, which has both a registry of qualified persons in the province and also has some events and other useful guidance materials that might be interesting to check out to people online. Other organizations like OSPI and OSGA have some best practices for management of excess soil at aggregate pit and quarries. There is a tool by the Canadian Urban Institute for an excess soil bylaw tool, basically, that helps to incorporate the regulatory language of the regulation into municipal bylaws. And finally, there is a resource by the ministry on the record of site condition, or the RSC, guide that is currently being updated and will also be available soon. And next, I'd like to invite my colleague, Laura Blees, who's also on the line. She's a senior policy advisor with the land use policy section and has worked on this file for way longer than I have, to quickly share some details about a resource that we've also been working on that people might be interested in. So Laura, if you're on the line, I'll share my screen and the tip sheet.
Hi, Rima. Good afternoon, everybody. And thanks for the opportunity to come and talk to this group. So as Rima mentioned, we did develop some additional resources for the smaller low risk soil movements. And this tip sheet that we've developed is now finalized, and feel free to share it out with anyone who may be interested. As you may have gathered through Rima's presentation, the bulk of the requirements on the excess soil regulation are on those generators of excess soil. And a lot of the heavier requirements are on those larger sites or the riskier sites that are more likely to have contamination. However, having said that, there are some regulatory rules that would apply. So this tip sheet helps to highlight some of those rules. So just to give a quick highlight here, I'm not going to go into too much detail as Rima's already covered this information, but we did give some initial questions around why we need to regulate excess soil in the first place, and that's to prevent the illegal dumping and ensure that soil that is being reused is of appropriate quality. So as mentioned, this tip sheet does talk about how small residential projects are affected. So here we're talking about those landscaping projects, pool digs, that type of thing. So there are some basic rules, as mentioned, that do apply to all soil movements. So depending where you're taking your soil, in certain cases, if you're taking it to a reuse site, there is written consent required, but this would not apply if you're going to waste disposal sites such as landfills, soil banks, storage sites, etc., and processors. There is some key information that the transporter of your soil would need to have for their hauling record, very basic information on the load. There are some storage rules that may apply. We do recognize, however, this may not apply in some of the projects where soil is getting excavated and taken off site immediately. So that may not be relevant. And then, I mean, as always, if there are any signs of your soil that is contaminated, there's an odor, soil staining, or buried tanks, that does kick you into some more requirements. So you may be wondering what exactly can you do with your soil from these lower risk soil movements. We always do encourage on-site reuse where it's practical and feasible, but we recognize that's not always possible. So if the soil needs to be taken off-site, there's a bit of detail here around if you're taking it to a reuse site, how to seek that consent from the owner. And on the next page here, we're just highlighting some other areas that this type of soil could be taken to, such as soil storage depots that we have established in our regulation. We have both the residential development soil depot and the landscaping soil depot as an option. In the case that the soil does have an unacceptable level of contamination or there is no local reuse sites, you could consider taking it to a landfill or a soil bank or a soil processor. The next part of the tip sheet here talks about some of the storage rules. As mentioned, these may not apply to your project, but in some cases there may need to be some storage for a short period of time. So basic rules around not creating an adverse effect from dust and sediment and those types of things. We do have some setbacks from water bodies and property lines, but definitely some exemptions provided for those. As mentioned, there's some key information for that hauling record. So we have a section here around, what is a hauling record? And this would be the basic information that project owner needs to provide in terms of where the soil is picked up, how much, the date and time, and some contact details. So yeah, and on to the next page here. And this, I was actually just having a look at some of the comments in the chat here as well. And we have heard, I guess, a little bit of misunderstanding and confusion in some cases on the regulation around these lower risk movements and what rules apply. So I think one goal of this tip sheet is really to clarify the requirements for those low risk movements around planning and sampling would in most cases not apply. So this next question here is around, do I need to test, track, and register my soil? So typically for these types of projects, these requirements would not kick in. So as Rima mentioned, those rules around the excess soil registry, having a tracking system, retaining a qualified person to do assessments, sampling, etc., that would typically not be required. We have included in this fact sheet the triggers where that would be required, but as you can see from this list of 3 things here, this is not your typical landscape pool dig projects. This is, coming from industrial sites, coming from a gas station, sites that are remediating. And then we do have a quantitative trigger, but it's pretty substantive. It's 2,000 cubic meters from within a settlement area. So you're looking at about 200 truckloads there. And that trigger does not apply in rural areas. Finally, as mentioned, if you do come across some contaminated soil during the dig, a smell or some visual cues that there's some contamination there, there's just some basic rules for procedures around segregating that soil and making sure if the soil is contaminated, that it's disposed of appropriately at a waste disposal facility. If the soil was very contaminated and it was hazardous waste soil, then that would not be managed under our soil regulation. It would be managed under the existing waste regime in Reg 347. And also, just as mentioned here, there's a bit of record keeping, 7 years for most documents and 2 years for the hauling record. And some additional links here to our local district office locator, as well as our general webpage. We wanted to provide this tip sheet because we do realize that a lot of homeowners that are doing pool digs and landscaping would not be familiar with these rules. So it's just a handy resource sheet that can help and hopefully help inform the contracts between the excavators and those residential projects. Thanks.
Laura.
Okay, thank you, Laura. So there are a lot of questions on the chat, and I mean the information that was provided is there's a lot there. It's overwhelming, but we as a landscape industry mostly fall under the 2,000 cubic meters, as you noted in your fact sheet. And so I think it's important to go over again exactly what the requirements are for landscape and pool digs, because most of the members will actually have excavated soil for most of their projects, either pathways or patios or pools or so, but it will be under 2,000 square feet. So just simply let's explain what is required. So a landscape is done in a residential property, a pool's included, it's less than 2,000 square meters or cubic meters. So what do we do? Let's go over it just simply.
Or do you want to take a?
Sure. Sure, I could take a first stab at this one if you like, Rima. So I think in the fact sheet on page 1 there, those 4 key things are probably the main things to pay attention to. So I guess the first question is, where is the soil going? And if the soil is going to a reuse site, there is a requirement to have that consent in writing from the reuse site owner to accept the soil. Recognize that the site may not always be going for reuse. So if it's going to a landfill, if it's going to a soil bank or a depot or processor, any of those other locations, that requirement would not be applicable. And then the other main requirement is providing any information to inform the hauling record. So whether you have a separate hauler or the excavator is the hauler, it would just be making sure that key information on the load around, the location, the quantity of soil that's moving, and just key contact information there. As far as the next 2 requirements around storage and if contamination is discovered, those again would depend if they apply to the project. So the basic storage rules may not apply if you're digging up and moving the soil immediately, but if they do, there are some very basic rules around the adverse effect and some setback rules as far as placing the soil next to a stream, for example.
Yes.
And as mentioned, the contamination, I don't think that's going to be a common one, but once in a while you have, a residential dig and a fuel tank is discovered, and then it would be different considerations.
I mean, that wouldn't happen very often. So we need to kind of focus on what happens every day. Okay? We're talking about thousands of jobs every day, right? So also on the chat line, so really there isn't that much to do because it's under 2,000 square cubic meters, and generally you have to have permission from the dump site, which you would have anyway, and you have to have some details for your hauler, which you would probably have anyway as well. And please correct me if I'm wrong on the chat line here. So there, yeah. So it's not really that onerous for our members. That's what I'm trying to get at. Because
exactly,
it's already,
and that's why.
Yeah,
that's why we really wanted to get this fact sheet out there, because there has been some misunderstanding around, all soil always needs to be registered and sampled and such. So we're really hoping this is now being shared broadly, that this will help to clarify that.
Right. Now, the other main theme through the chat line is, so maybe the dump sites are confused as well, because many of the members have received letters saying we're not taking your soil unless it's tested, even if it's under 2,000 cubic meters. So how do we deal with that? Is that a misunderstanding at the dump site?
Well, so we have, if the soil is being reused at a reuse site, the regulation does say, make sure that the soil you're accepting is of appropriate quality for the purpose that you're accepting it for. So a dump site is a little different from that. And as of now, because excess soil we've categorized it as a waste, sites would need to have an approval from us to just be managing accepting soil if they're just storing it from many different projects, or if they are processing it on their site. And if they do have an approval from us, that approval might outline, well, you can only accept soil of certain quality as well. So one thing I just wanted to clear, and I was looking at the chat as well, I think dump sites aren't the same as reuse sites. That's one distinction we have provided through our regulation. Reuse sites involve having a actual use for that soil that's being accepted, and if there is that use for that soil, the soil should be of appropriate quality and quantity.
Yeah, but the problem has been, so I've seen a letter from some of the members that they've received from their where they normally place their fill. And the letter's saying we're not accepting your fill unless it's tested. And so there must be a confusion out there in the in those companies that accept soil and fill. So we need to figure out how to deal with that confusion, because it's going to cause a backup of soil going anywhere, or fill going anywhere. And it's also, what are they going to do with that? Or they're going to have to pay extra for it to get it tested. Like there's confusion there that needs to be dealt with.
Town Police Chair.
How do we deal with that, Laura?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think it is fair to say, our regulation is complicated, and there are some reuse sites and some landfills that are, I think, still kind of grappling with understanding the requirements there. So perhaps one option could be sharing this tip sheet with them that outlines, when sampling is required or not, and demonstrating that, for a lot of these projects, you wouldn't require sampling. It is a little bit of tricky situation when we come to the reuse side of things, because our regulation is very much focused on the generator of excess soil. We do have some requirements for very large reuse sites to register and such, but as far as the day-to-day movements of soil, a reuse site owner isn't really required to do a lot under our regulation, and they may decide that they want to have some confirmatory sampling, or they may want to see some information of where the soil is coming from. And I mean, it's really sort of within their jurisdiction to ask for that additional information. I think some of this as well is, the regulation is new, people are learning, they're getting used to the new standards and the rules, and it is complicated. So I think ongoing education and outreach, if there's like a particular site that you're struggling with, and our operational staff or our policy staff can help clarify which rules apply, that could also help get over the hump. And we're open to whatever else might be helpful beyond the fact sheet to support some of those challenges.
We may actually have to organize a meeting with all the dump sites.
Tony, I just have a question. I don't know if it's appropriate for me to interrupt.
Absolutely is. So actually, please feel free to ask your questions.
Okay, so anyone can answer this, but we're a small landscape company. We probably only excavate like 10 cubic meters from a job. Some of it we use, and then some of it we bring back to our yard, and we'll rescreen it and either use it in other jobs or sell it as screened soil. And so what are our regulations for that situation? What do we need to do? Are we required to test it? No one else brings anything into us. It's just from our company.
Rima, did you want me to take this one, or you got it?
Sure, you can take this one. I was trying to see if I was muted or not, but I'm not. Go ahead.
So as far as excess soil that leaves and comes back to a project area, there's very minimal rules that would apply. We want to encourage on-site reuse, even if it needs to go off-site temporarily. The material that you're bringing back and selling as a product, I'm not sure if that would fall within like a landscape depot or a product.
Yeah, we'd be a landscape depot, but we just don't bag it or anything. It's just like bulk.
Yeah, so that might fall under, like, as Rima had mentioned, for the landscape depots, we do have a few regulatory rules where that can continue to happen without needing to get a waste CCA.
So it looks like Kelly can continue doing what she's doing without any problem. That's what it sounds like here. Yeah,
we did create that carve out for these types of landscaping depots, essentially.
Right. There's a comment here that I've heard repeatedly, the last one from David Comfort. I've just checked the site for Try Recycling in London, and they are no longer accepting commercial soil loads now. So that's a repeated question that I get as well. So somehow we've got to get to those receivers of excess soil and fill, and get them to understand the complexities of this legislation, because it's gonna cause a lot of hardship here. So how do we do that is the question.
Yeah, I
Will
think
you
we
do
could
that? Will
definitely.
you reach out to them? Like,
Yeah, I think we could definitely take it back to the team to consider about, you know, on the reuse side, what additional outreach might be needed to either landfills or just general reuse sites. Is it generally landfills that you're having the challenges with, or just reuse sites in general?
I'm not sure if somebody wants to, if a contractor wants to unmute.
Tony, can I ask something?
Yes, please.
So I've spoken to some of my waste management companies, and what they said is they take the dirt in, then they're testing it and having it taken out. But they're going to take it out in larger volumes than us landscapers are going to bring it in. So that's where their worry is how are they going to know what load came in that was contaminated? And then they're stuck taking out the full load that has slight bit of contamination in it. So they're refusing it altogether. Does that make sense?
This is at a
Yeah,
depot, like a landscaping depot?
No, it's going to be like a waste management company. We used to take, well, last year we took all our dirt to one of these waste management companies, but because of these new regulations, they're saying we're not taking dirt because they can't keep track of who brought in what. And if one load is contaminated out of the 40 they brought in, suddenly they're stuck with a contaminated load because they're going to haul it out, let's say, in tractor trailers or bigger volumes than us bringing it in with our small bins, right?
Right.
This is at like gravel pits as well in our area. A lot of the gravel pits we deal with, they accept clean fill and stuff like that, and they're no longer accepting it. So it's multiple areas that anyone that's accepting soil are just saying no, because yeah, like I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, but like he said, small loads of soil are going to add up, and somewhere along the line it might be contaminated. They can't pinpoint where that's coming from.
Yeah, this
I'm
might
glad
be
you
an,
brought up. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
you know, I was going to say this may be an unintended consequence of this regulation. Like it actually could stop the entire industry from operating, right? And so we need to deal with that, and either we deal with it through education of the depots, or we ask for a halt on the legislation until we do this. Because I don't think, I'm pretty sure the ministry didn't think that they were going to adversely affect the landscape, the entire landscape industry, if they can't get rid of their excess soil. So we do have to do something about it.
And I'm glad someone brought up the pits and quarries. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure if this was in Rima's presentation or not, but just in case to mention so that everybody's aware, the Ministry of Natural Resources did put up a proposal recently to basically suggest alignment of all their pit and quarry rehabs with the new regulation, clarifying the rules around that. So I know the posting period has closed on that, and they're hoping to move ahead with some clarity for pits and quarries, because that is one area that is seen as a reuse site for soil in larger quantities.
Right. There's also earlier on, I think Rima or you, Laura, may have mentioned a list of depots. Is there an official list of sites that the ministry has compiled?
We don't have a list of depots that we manage, but I'd mentioned, through the excess soil registry that's now online, that might be a resource to search for certain destination sites like depots or reuse sites that might be in your area that are currently accepting soil. There's we have our, through the ministry, we have this website called Access Environment, which has a list of all approved waste sites within the province. And while at this point, they don't really, you can't filter it through just the sites that accept soil, but that is another resource that you can use to find established sites, maybe in your area, that could be the resource. And I think when, the industry is getting used to this, the regulation and adopting some of the requirements within it. There may be more sites that, like people were mentioning, recycling sites or transfer processing sites and waste sites that at this point may have, as a measure, they may not be accepting excess soil, but there may be sites that may be trying to incorporate more of these requirements and the acceptance of excess soil at those sites. So I think those things would be changing, but definitely the registry and access environment are two resources that could be used to look at some of these types of receiving sites for soil. I don't know, Laura, if you have anything else to add.
And on the supply and demand side of things, it is also worth noting that there are a few companies that have established that are basically providing matching services, kind of like soil dating, I guess, where, they could be retained to help find an appropriate home for your materials is another option.
At this point, I'd like to open it up to discussion with all the attendees. So just unmute yourself if you have a question. We'll see how this works. Hopefully it works orderly. Anyone want more clarification? Just unmute yourself.
Who's
and
enforcing
go for
this?
it.
Like, how is this being enforced, I guess?
Yeah, so we have on the ministry's side, our compliance teams, they would be doing inspections as needed. For those sites that are on the registry, enforcement might be, carried out with those known sites as well. Sometimes there is proactive enforcement happening if the members of the public or other people are calling in about certain issues. So that's one way of this being enforced.
Just to add on to that as well, our regulation builds on other instruments that are in place. So like an aggregate pit license or permit or a municipal permit, etc. So those tools would continue to be enforced by the bodies who issue those instruments.
Okay.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I got one.
Okay, Pino.
So are there going to be actual enforcement officers out there, or will it be MTO officers, York Regional Police, Toronto Police, who can just pull us over and ask us where our dirt is coming from, and if we have paperwork in place for this dirt? Like, how? I don't understand how the enforcement factor of this is going to work, because I've heard that some 200 enforcement officers have been hired to police this. So I just want to understand what exactly we need to have in place when we're moving dirt where we're not going to get penalized. Because over the years, we found that certain officers don't even know their own rules.
Well, I haven't heard about these 200 new officers. That'd be amazing if we had some more support in our compliance team. So I'm not sure if that's accurate or not. As far as like from the ministry side, we do have, a compliance team that works on implementing this regulation as well as other regulations. It's still, we have been developing this regulation over a number of years and consulted on it many times, but it is complicated and it is still fairly new for a lot of people. So we are really focusing on like an education and outreach approach initially. I don't know, Rima, if you have anything to add from Rima used to work on the enforcement side of things, so.
Yeah, in terms of, what you might be required to have, I mentioned and Laura mentioned a few key requirements, such as a hauling record. There's, if somebody is pulled over at that point, what you would be required to show would be that hauling record. So just looking over those sort of key requirements that we've gone over in this regulation, and just making sure that you're keeping good records is, I think, one way that somebody who's just dealing with this day to day can just do to make sure that they're in compliance, and just being aware of your role in the project or in the whole cycle of excess soil management, situating yourself within this regulation and understanding the rules that apply to you. And of course, if you have questions or if you're clear about those rules, again, always feel free to get in touch with us, and we'll be happy to clarify the applicable rules that would be applicable to your company or to yourself.
Yeah, my experience with legislation over the years is there's usually a period of time where it's there's education, and most of the enforcement takes that form. So I wouldn't, Pino, I wouldn't be afraid of being fined like tomorrow. I think there's so much that everybody needs to understand at this point, and there seems to be some unintended consequences as well that we have to deal with. Any other questions?
I just have a question about storage. I'm just wondering if you can confirm what the requirements are of if you have excess soil stored at your location, maybe that will be transported at a later time.
Yeah, of course. And I have this available in the deck that I was previously sharing. So maybe I'll just switch to that again, just so there's a reference point. Hopefully you can see the presentation now. But there are a few rules around storing soil at a site for longer term. So it's just things like the stockpile sizes that you would need to keep in mind, having them be segregated from soil of different quality, setback limits. I think Laura had mentioned these that you would need to keep in mind depending on where you've stored the soil, and just generally ensuring that it's stored in a way that prevents contamination from the soil traveling to groundwater. There's some additional rules around liquid soil storage. So if you're storing liquid soil at a site, there's things like, storing it on an impermeable surface, the amount of soil that you can keep at the site. And all of these are outlined within that rules for soil management document. And I've just summarized them here in the appendix. But yeah, these are the type of rules that could apply. And as well, if you have a municipal bylaw or some other type of site-specific instrument in place, that may also provide either additional or different storage rules that you'd need to abide by.
Thank you.
Any other questions that you want to unmute yourself for? Please go ahead.
I may have missed this, and if so, I apologize. Is there a template somewhere of how we should be doing the record keeping?
On the ministry side, we haven't provided templates really for the types of documents or records you could be creating. We have outlined through our regulation the information that should be in certain records. So for example, the hauling records that I spoke about, there's a list of things that should be included in the hauling record, but we haven't provided a specific template that needs to be used, and that's just to allow for some flexibility for how people may have been using their own sort of systems or templates that are already in place.
Okay, thank you.
Just
Any
to
other
add to that too,
sorry.
ONEA has developed that template for single and multi-load hauling records that is provided in the resource slide. And just to mention, there is discussion around templates, and I think over the coming months there is some interest from industry partners to maybe develop some of those templates. So although the ministry probably won't be releasing them, I feel like there's going to be more resources coming out over the coming months.
Great, thank you. Any other comments?
Okay, so
is there any way that we can go? There's a lot of questions that are in the chat. I've added a bunch. Is there any way that we can just kind of do a scan through and maybe have Rima or Laura answer a number of those questions? Because I think a lot of us all have those questions on there, and if you could answer them, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I was trying to kind of group them together, and most of the questions were around smaller loads and what to do, and concerns around these soil depots.
So otherwise, I can just kind of accumulate all of my questions in there. Basically, we own a pit. We have a licensed pit. Typically, we have landscapers, homeowners who bring their soil mixed with, could be interlock brick, could be soil, could be sod, and it's all mixed together. And for years, they've just come with the small little trailer loads and dumped. And now, unfortunately, with this change, this now means that we will need to do testing. So, for instance, if they'll come and they'll dump, and from our perspective, we've heard that upwards of about 1,000 cubic meters at a time, we will need to do testing. And testing now involves a great deal, which means it's upwards of, let's say, $2,000 per test. So then comes the idea that, yes, what if one of those tests come back and it's contaminated? So now I have 1,000 cubic meters, for instance, that's just one pile. We're going to try to separate them into various piles. So now this pile is contaminated. So now I have to bring this pile to a landfill. But from my, I'm trying to understand then, nobody is required to do any testing. All of these small loads don't need any testing. So now, does it actually mean that us as a pit, a licensed pit, will need to test? Because technically all of this material will be rehabilitated, which means that it is actually considered a beneficial purpose. So do we have to test? And if so, then what happens if it's contaminated? So this is where, a lot of the landscapers, where they're getting these answers of no, the pits and these depots are not accepting anything because there's too much confusion. We're told that we have to test upon test upon test, thousands and thousands of dollars, and somehow somebody's going to have to pay for this. So the question then comes down to, what are we required to do? How much, like if a small, load comes in, what paperwork do we need on that small load? From this meeting here today, it sounds like we don't need to ask them for any paperwork other than, where it's coming from, just some small information, but they don't need to do the testing. Now all the ownership is on the pit to have to do all this testing. So that's a lot of money and a lot of uncertainty. So that's where the insecurity is coming into play. So that's just one of the things. Landscapers, even homeowners will bring this stuff to us. So now what do we do for this poor homeowner who once paid $40 to dump, is now going to have to pay $150 to dump, and then comes down to the cost as well for all the landscapers. So that's where all this issue is coming into play. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that example. It's always good to have kind of a real life example for people to chew on and understand. So I guess I just wanted to reiterate that all the requirements, or most of the requirements in our excess soil regulation, is to really shift that responsibility to the generator of excess soil. So you're correct, a lot of these smaller projects are not going to get kicked into sampling and such. That doesn't mean that the reuse site has to then pick up all of that sampling. Essentially, that would be up to you what kind of assessments you feel are necessary. So if you were bringing in cleaner materials and you feel comfortable with the quality of that material, it's really up to you if you want to do any additional assessments. I mean, obviously, barring if there's anything in your license, there could be requirements there. I'm not sure. But otherwise, it's really up to the person receiving the soil. So, if you're receiving clean soil and you're comfortable with that, you can continue to do that. But if you feel like you want to do some sampling, or if you feel like you want to ask for sampling from the person who's bringing soil to you, you do have that option, but it's not required. As far as the larger reuse sites, you might get triggered into that large reuse site requirement to register if you're bringing in large amounts of soil, but otherwise, it's really up to you what kind of assessments you would like to do.
Then would that also come down to if the soil is mixed with sod or with interlock bricks or concrete bricks or anything like that, can it all be mixed together, or does it have to be separated, or?
So I think, and Rima, feel free to jump in if you have anything to add on this, but like those other materials would, I think, continue to be managed as inert fill. Is that your understanding, Rima?
Yeah, and I'm not sure, you know, the actual, I guess, ratio of what you're accepting as soil versus how much of other material is mixed in. But, you know, essentially if what you are accepting is largely rock, for example, or largely sod, or if it doesn't fit the definition of excess soil, then it would, like Laura said, be managed as inert fill, which is, you know, under a different regulation, and this regulation's requirements wouldn't really apply to that situation.
So for instance, let's say like a pool company is digging out a pool and they bring it to us. Technically, they're coming in smaller loads. It's going to be under the, what is it, 200 cubic meter?
2,000. 2,000.
Oh, 2,000, excuse me, I apologize. Yes, thank you. So basically, we don't really need to worry about anything. We can accept it. And if we have any concerns, fine. But otherwise, it could be mixed because they're digging out. So it's going to be both sod, soil, and sand. So that can all be mixed together, brought into we have, again, the licensed pit. So then we fall under the Pits and Quarries Aggregate Resource Act, and we should be fine. So none of this excess soil rule technically applies to us.
Yeah, I think in general, if you're receiving, you know, cleaner loads and it's stuff like soil and sand, like the soil and sand that fits within the scope of the definitions would fall under our regulation, but there's, as mentioned, not a lot of requirements that apply to the reuse site. And then there is that kind of inert fill for other materials that would be outside of our regulation. So there's not a lot of new requirements in this type of situation. I think in some cases, people are just getting comfortable with the regulation. They may be nervous about it. They may be asking for sampling just for comfort purposes, which they can do. So I think we just need to, you know, continue to outreach to those reuse sites to help share that information around what applies when, because our intent was not to have, you know, cleaner soil be sampled all the time. One of the policy objectives of our regulation is to support that local reuse where it makes sense.
Thank you. So Ryan Dean's microphone's not active. Can you ask if people want to, if they want clean fill, if clean fill is a clean fill receptacle considered a depot, receiver considered a depot, not a pit? For example, a farm location looking to fill in an area to level out. So how does that?
So that would, looking for fill to level out an area, that would be considered a reuse site, not a depot. The way we've defined depots is that you're accepting soil of a certain quality to then be reselling it as material.
So it's a reuse.
Soil, it's a reuse site, yeah.
And so if it's a reuse site, there's no testing involved unless the owner wants to test. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions? Now's your opportunity. Okay, so I'm going to summarize. So it looks like most of the landscape jobs are not affected by the bulk of the regulations. But what's unintended is the depots and reuse sites that are basically saying that they don't want the material because they're not sure where it came from or if it's contaminated or it must be tested. So to me, that means that we have to focus some education on the reuse and depot sites and make sure they understand what's required, because it seems like most of them are just, from a risk management perspective, they're basically saying, no, we're not accepting it because of this regulation. And that's a very serious issue that we need to deal with before spring, because that could just stop everything. So that's the main summary I have of this meeting. And if you have any advice on what our next steps are to educate the depots and the reuse sites, the dump sites, that would be, yeah, let's figure that out together. Let's do that.
Sorry, can I ask one more question?
Yep.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
In terms of all the landscapers, if now we're talking about these small amounts, do they need to provide a written agreement to the pit or the reuse site? Or does the reuse site or pit need to ask for this? Or because it's a small amount, they don't need to have that anymore?
If you are the reuse site that's accepting the soil, you would need to provide written confirmation that you agree to the acceptance of the soil at your site.
Do you need it for each job or just one from the company itself?
Typically, you would need to understand or provide consent to each site that's providing you with material if you're the reuse site. Laura, I don't know if you have any other suggestions.
Yeah,
around
so
that.
that's right. Like it's basically a written agreement from each location. So you could have one agreement to take lots of material from that location, but if you're then taking material from another location, you'd have to have a separate agreement.
And is there a something already in place that we could get this written agreement, sent to us by email, or we can find it online somewhere?
So
I think we lost Laura.
Yeah. There isn't a template that, again, we have. I know some people use the MTO's OPSS 180 forms, which sometimes have information around owners accepting certain material from sites that that they're accepting. So sometimes people have been using that. I'm not sure if that would actually maybe not apply for your situation, but this is, again, it's not like you have to provide that information to the ministry, or it needs to be in a certain format. It's just to ensure that soil isn't being illegally dumped at your property. So whatever information you need to provide for that consent is up to you. But as long that it is a requirement that should be in place to ensure that reuse of soil.
Hi, it's Laura. Sorry, I think I got cut out there. And I think one of the things that we're hoping this, the fact sheet will help to clarify what requirements there are, but also help guide if there's situations like separate projects, like a pool dig or a landscaping, then hopefully that can be built into the contract. So those details are all covered through the contract.
There's still questions in terms of detailed questions in the chat here.
Tony, I've got a question. Hey, it's Ryan from Divots. How are you, Tony?
Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
So as a landscape supply company, every yard of material we send to a home or a commercial site, we need a written letter or an approval from the homeowner or project manager or anything like that. Is that what I'm understanding?
Sorry, so you're sending material for reuse at these sites?
Yeah, so if we're sending out topsoil as a landscape supply company 1 yard at a time to a homeowner, every homeowner that, say we do 60 deliveries a day, each one of those 60 people need to give us approval for the drop, like written approval. Is that what I'm understanding?
So
Ryan,
but again, like go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, no, so Ryan, my understanding is that they've asked for the soil, so that's your approval. I don't think you need to do anything more.
Okay, I just didn't know if there was something else that we need to do.
Yeah, no, you don't need to do anything else. It's just there's a record anyway, right?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay, I was seeing administrative costs going up there for a second. Thank you for clarifying.
And part of the reason, one of the reasons why we didn't provide detailed templates on everything is we want to try and keep things simple, where people maybe already have some kind of written agreement in place. They can just use that existing paperwork and not have to have a new form to fill out.
And I expect most of that exists anyway, right? So Yeah, that's my understanding as well. So Kelly has another question here. We could dig 3 different locations in a day and have to provide 3 different written consents to the pits.
I was just writing and thinking at the same time. Essentially, I was just understanding that like we could dig at one location and another location and have 2 different truckloads in a day and go to the same depot or like gravel pit and have to provide written consent. But that was already answered. Where you could have a contract that, yeah.
Okay.
I just had a quick question about the letters that were received by the depots. Were they requiring, or did they say they're not going to allow any soil to be dumped, or are they saying that they're going to require testing?
So I've received a couple of comments from members where one of the letters I saw said they weren't accepting any more from landscapers unless the soil was tested and they had proof of test. So I think that's a misunderstanding of what the regulation is saying, because they're under 2,000 cubic meters anyway.
Okay, there's a couple of us in here from A&L Canada Laboratories. We've been getting some requests, so we're just trying to understand how we can help to support the industry, and if need be, we could possibly look at consulting a bit and maybe even creating a package that would cover some needs, but maybe just give them some peace of mind without going through hundreds of different tests. So I just thought maybe I would mention that we are interested in just having a conversation and maybe contributing to that a bit, and maybe we could help.
That's good to know, Lisa. So we'll take that under advisement. Okay. Any more? One last chance here. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Rima and Laura, for helping us to understand. And my main takeaway here is that we need to make sure that the education process continues, especially for those that receive soil, because it could be serious this year if we don't. Okay. Anyway, thanks everyone. Have a great weekend.